So in this paper I'm going to be looking at a certain reading of Kafka law in Kafka and taking that reading and applying it to recent Palestinian cinema, a number of case studies. So I'm going to open with a quote. And when speaking of the function of the law in the trial, Demetrius Varoufakis states of Joseph K. His entrapment by the law disperses over his entire milieu. He enjoys freedom of movement, but everywhere he goes, everyone seems to have already judged him as guilty for something indistinct, unexpressed, unknown. Joseph K. finds himself trapped by an omnipresent and omnipotent law. He finds himself trapped in a cage without walls. And with this passage, Varoufakis articulates what he terms Kafka's empty law. To quote, a generalized sense of engagement that pervades Kafka's work, notably the metamorphosis and the trial. The figure of imprisonment is key to Kafka's work. But a wider question as to what shape that figure takes through its enactment by law is one with consequences beyond the work of Kafka. This paper will attempt to trace the shapes of confinement by law that are manifestations of its emptiness. The spectre of the figure of Kafka and a construal of law as empty are, this paper argues, key to understanding and articulation of space in a number of recent Palestinian films, scenes from which will be read to illustrate this. And reading Varoufakis' empty law through a cinematic lens, Deleuze's concept of the perception image with three signs, which he uses to articulate perspective in cinema, solid, liquid, and gaseous, will be re-articulated to read a multi-directional movement of confinement on screen, from the solid or the molar to the molecular, the liquid. Thus, we'll see the empty law can take various forms, whilst also remaining contentless, and I'll pick out some of these key terms as the paper continues. So this gives it points of condensation, as we see in cinema, into bodily presence, but also vaporization into pervasive absence. And another reason for opening with this quote is that Varoufakis sees in Kafka's beginnings a sense of an already incarceration, which can also be seen in the openings of a number of recent Palestinian films. A seemingly paradoxical juxtaposition of freedom of movement with incarceration can be illustrated through a reading of opening scenes of incarceration, which are both fluid and solid. And what I argue is this points to a trajectory, this points not to a trajectory, a loss of freedom unfolding over time and space, or a shrinking space, which Nurit Gertz and George Khalifi in their book Palestinian Cinema, Landscape, Trauma and Memory have identified as characterizing recent Palestinian cinema, but rather, as I stated, an already incarceration, so imprisonment from beginnings. And three such openings will now be briefly analysed to elaborate on this. And the first is from a 2006 film by Kamal Aljafari called The Roof. And I'm just going to show the opening scene, which is a little isolated from the rest of the film.
نفس الغرفة كله كان في كوت طبقتين.
غرفة كبيرة يعني.
غرفة كبيرة. يمكن هنا تقريبا 80 متر مربع يعني شيء.
80 كبيرة.
بس فيها خوتة تاخد جنب الثاني. وبالوسط كان في هيك مساحة الواحد يتمشى مرات هيك.
قد ايه عدد السنين؟ 3 أشهر؟
6 أشهر ونص.
6 أشهر
So there's very little detail given. He alludes to a time in prison, which turns out to be during the First Intifada. But the reason I've taken that scene is its opening with a flattened, compressed shot of a rain-blurred window. And the interior is undetermined. We never really figure out exactly where they are. Perhaps a cafe or a bar. The mise-en-scène is quite opaque. And the description of his time in prison is matched by a formal claustrophobia. The shallow focus and the tight framing bring the interlocutor's profile looming into the foreground, and the background is abstracted, raindrops streaming down a window, which add to the oppressiveness and arguably the confinement of the location. And slightly later on in the scene, there's also a dislocating sense of irony. So while narrating his experience of prison, Aljafari talks of the friends he made and lost touch with, and he references his friend Nabi, who he fell out of touch with because he said, and I quote, "Because I didn't know what to say to him. I was free and he was in prison." And these words ring hollow, as both in this scene, both characters are held captive by the static and flattened frame. Where's my... Aha. And just to move on to another opening scene, this is from Elia Suleiman's film The Time That Remains, and it opens in a way that has some quite striking similarities with the work of Kamal Aljafari, with a taxi driver collecting the director, who also plays the main character. Yes, and in this scene, it opens initially in darkness and is punctuated by the opening of a car boot. And the angle is particularly striking. It's shot from a low angle looking out from the boot. It's claustrophobic, somewhat menacing. And also the perspective itself is perhaps familiar in cinematic convention as the point of view shot of an abductee. And as the scene continues, the taxi ride itself, in shallow focus, with a rainstorm disorienting both the driver and the viewer, continues this sense of enclosure and confinement. And this particular scene here is laced with irony, also as the solid grey wall, looming and enclosing the space behind the taxi, are posters of rolling pastoral landscapes with Jaffa oranges in the corner. And the slogan, Eretz Akeret, meaning different land, is written at the bottom. And this difference can be read throughout the film as a disorientation and dislocation of space. So, and again, to save time, I've used stills rather than too many clips. A more solid form of incarceration is at work in the opening shot of Kamal Aljafari's second film, Port of Memory. And this is a film that more explicitly deals with the concept or the absence of the law, and the space of the law, as we'll see through scenes later. Here is more molar and solid, in contrast with the preceding two scenes. Tight framing and a flat compressed shot here slowly reveals the wall of a ruined house. The fading blue light casts a blue cold hue over the shot, which tracks left along the wall, revealing scars of the neglect that can be seen here. A broken balcony, the jagged struts of a staircase, jutting out like spikes. The looming wall fills the frame, introducing a language of confinement and walls, explicit walls, which runs throughout the film. And before elaborating on how the empty law functions cinematically, I'm going to briefly trace its genealogy. So Vasilakis takes his lead from Spinoza, specifically the theological political treatise, for the dual functional modes he sees in the empty law of necessity and contingency. And the key point here is that he sees the function of law as important rather than its content. So that is to say that unquestioning obedience of the law is what matters, i.e. what is necessary. And this is accompanied by contingency, which, citing the Ten Commandments here in Moses' law, is the function of a law that depends on the circumstances and the coming together of a community. And thus writes Varilakis, and I quote, "The law is empty because it's both necessary and contingent." And this emptiness or lack of content that Varilakis sees in Kafka's law puts him in dialogue with Giorgio Agamben, who also draws a lot on the work of Kafka, albeit from different sources. Agamben draws on a logic of law without content for his theory of the state of exception, which he traces back through Gershom Scholem to Immanuel Kant, who he first cites as articulating a simple form of law, which is articulated in Kant's Critique of Practical Reason. And for Kant, a law abstracted of content remains as what he refers to, and I quote, as an empty universal legislation. And then Agamben takes this 0 point of content or signification as the stage at which life and law blur. Without content, the law becomes all the more pervasive and becomes indistinguishable from life itself, and thus more threatening. He cites the life lived in the village in Kafka's The Castle as an example of this lack of content and its pervasiveness. What both Varilakis and Agamben recognise is that in this Kafkaesque law is the very lack of content, or its invisibility, is precisely what gives it its pervasiveness and menace. In Varilakis' reading of empty law, he recognises it as taking two distinct forms, which I interpret as, well, he defines a theological form and a biopolitical form. And the theological, alluding to, in the trial, the judge's inability to be swayed from any decision, points to a kind of a divine sense of legal temporality. And a biopolitical one, which I think is the one I'm going to pick up with and use here, is a fundamentally more spatial form. And this is the one I argue is key to understanding the form of law operating in recent Palestinian films, and articulating a movement between different states of law and differing modes of incarceration. And a key relation in this biopolitical mode that the Varilakis sets up is what he refers to as empty law being both universal and contingent. And how he does this is by stating that it's essentially the lack of content of the law that is universalized, which puts the force of law into a populace. And then here lies its contingency. And he takes this interpretation of a scene from the trial. So when Titorelli, the painter, says the judges are invisible, it's not because they're hidden and their judgments assume universally true content, but rather because they're everywhere and their judgments are arbitrary. Everyone is a judge. Everyone condemns Joseph K. from the very first moment of his arrest without charge. And herein lies the biopolitical aspect of the empty law. It's dispersed universally into the populace. So without any content, at its root, judgments are arbitrary and arguably contingent upon the mood of what is termed the guardian of the law, which I'll look at very briefly in a short moment. And this movement makes empty law, as I stated, a fundamentally biopolitical space. And with that space in mind, I'll now attempt to trace in a couple of scenes these forms of engagement that the empty law occasions. Firstly, from Kamal Aljafari's Port of Memory, and then, if I have time, Hani Abu Asad's Omar. Port of Memory, Aljafari's second film, tells the story of Selim, who might be, as we'll see, who, due to what might be termed administrative amnesia, is on the verge of losing his home. The loss of home works as an analogy for the wider experience of Jaffa, the city in which the film is set. Thank you. And the scene here captures a particularly, I think, striking Kafkaesque form of law. It shows, or perhaps more accurately, obscures a dialogue between Selim, the film's protagonist, and his lawyer as they discuss the whereabouts of the deeds to Selim's house. Anyway, I'll scoot forward and describe the scene. So what we see is the scene purely from the perspective of Selim. So the lawyer, here the guardian of what I argue is the empty law, is completely off screen, merely a voice. We hear him in this first scene dismissing a previous client and then discussing Selim's problem. And it's spatial in a particularly Kafkaesque sense, as Selim finds himself here before the law. And I'll briefly bring up a piece from Kafka's Parable, which has been widely interpreted. And in the parable, a man, as you can, well, I'll let you read it for yourself rather than read it through. So a man from the country encounters a gatekeeper. He requests access to the law, which is deferred rather than denied, yet the gate remains open. And one reading of the parable here is that there is no such law. In fact, law itself is in the words and deeds of those who guard it, such as the gatekeeper here, or Selim's lawyer. In the scene I tried to show, Selim finds himself essentially abandoned before the law, and in a slightly Agamben sense, it renders him an outlaw, both outside the law and before it. He's held outside a law which he's unable to locate, yet also trapped by it before this very contentless, and in this case, disembodied law. The lawyer claims to have lost the deeds. And the law's emptiness is further emphasized in the scene I've just shown by a double absence. As I stated, the documentation, not only is the lawyer missing, but the documentation itself, the actual text of the law, which would support Selim's claim, is missing, and the lawyer has no recollection of it. And this inaccessibility of any content echoes a scene in Kafka's The Trial, where he attempts to locate the law books to ascertain what he's being accused of, and when he finally finds them, they don't contain any records of proceedings, but just pornographic pictures. So the law as such here is without content, making decisions connected to it both contingent and arbitrary. And the contingency and invisibility of the empty law is taken to its limit point in a later scene, which I've taken a still from here, important memory, when the already invisible lawyer disappears completely, when Selim returns to his office, which is now boarded up at the top of a staircase, again at the mercy of an arbitrary, inaccessible law. And the X on the door here, I interpret as marking the vanishing point. So X marks the spot of absence. And this is the contingency of the empty law. It's shifting materiality, as it occasionally, in the scene we didn't manage to see, it was disembodied, but it was in some form of person. Here it returns to a nebulous, pervasive, contentless. And I think these two scenes mark a key spatial movement, articulating cinematically how this universal contingency of the empty law operates. So its universalized lack of content can be read as a sense of generalized engagement, which operates often through framing. This can be seen in Port of Memory, reflected in language of walls and surfaces which dominate the mise-en-scène, both interior and exterior shots. There is really no sense of an exterior. However, the contingency of the empty law marks a movement back from this generalized engagement and non-appearance into moments of like condensation, I think is what I'm arguing, to an insidious presence, which can operate cyclically and in multiple directions. And if this scene works, I can show you a brief color of it. Okay, so this is a scene from 5 Broken Cameras, which is a documentary, in fact, but there's quite a striking scene in the middle. It tells the story of Emma Burnett, who is a farmer turned filmmaker activist, and documents the protests of the villagers of Billion, his village, as they are in dispute with Israeli settlers over a land border, which cuts them off from their farmland. And it's quite a cyclical narrative, but during the middle of the film, this scene, the soldiers appear at Emmett's door and declare his home a closed military zone, and proceed to allegedly read the documentation that supports this. So his house has been declared a closed military zone and thus should be evacuated, and he's told that anyone found in a closed military zone is violating military orders. And I don't have time to go into the full detail, but in declaring this space of home a closed military zone, the soldier as law, an embodiment of law here, pronounces a reconfiguration of the space. Emmet is immediately, in the temporal sense and also without mediation, rendered like Salim in the previous scene, both before and outside the law. So he's also configured spatially as inside, an intruder within the now closed military zone. And later on in the film, again alluding to a lack of content, the charges which lead to his house arrest following this scene are dropped, citing lost evidence. So again, there's a disappearance of any kind of content to determine his guilt by law. And very briefly, I won't have time to go through this, but following Varda-Lucke's equation of both engagement and freedom of movement, which initially seems paradoxical within anti-law, this film, Hani Abu Asad's Omar, which deals with the topic of collaboration, it seems from a framing and stylistic point of view a very different film. It's a lot more kinetic, there's a lot more movement. But again, citing the notion of the trial as essentially a space in which Joseph K. enjoys freedom of movement but is always already judged guilty. So that leads to this abstract sense of engagement. This very similar narrative hangs over the entire film. And even in scenes of fluid movement and kineticism, such as this opening scene where he's being pursued through the streets of Jerusalem, there's a visual leitmotif of ever narrowing passageways and confinement, closing him in. And the narrative basically, very briefly, tells a story of multiple betrayals. So Omar and his friends are used. He's befriended by an agent who he doesn't realise in prison is not an Arab due to his perfect Arabic until he speaks Hebrew later on in the film. And although they're manipulated, Omar and the agent, Rami, form quite a close bond at times, and this runs throughout the film, this notion of essentially a levelling of who is to be trusted, who is a friend, who is an enemy. And Omar and his friends constantly are caught in this net and this network of mistrust, collaboration and betrayal. And again, this renders every character a potential double, a potential spy, again echoing the universal contingency of the biological mode of Kafka's empty law. And I'm going to jump very briefly to a conclusion to sum up there. So I didn't get a chance to show as much of this as I'd like, but through these various readings of empty law and through these fluid movements of confinement, what I'm trying to articulate in my wider work, and the chapter I'm working on at the moment, is that what emerges on screen is what might be termed a plasticity of confinement that law enacts. And law is a way to a very underused and underinterpreted way of reading the articulations of space in Palestinian cinema. It's something I haven't really found in the literature. And I believe it's key to understanding spatial relations in contemporary Palestinian cinema, and also how the figure of empty law can be seen as in images of both movement and status alike. So I'll finish there.
So I'm going to play first a video by Joanne Richardson. It's called In Transit. It was done in 2008, so I'm just going to play a bit of it.
Am văzut revoluția la televizor, ca majoritatea românilor. Însă de la distanță, după ce imaginile au făcut înconjurul pământului, încărcate de o simplitate de nespus. O tipică demonstrație de masă orchestrată de putere. Ceaușescu observă o mișcare neașteptată în mulțime. Discursul său șovăie, camera tremură. Imaginea se întrerupe, apoi dispare. Cei care se uită la televizor văd că spectacolul s-a prăbușit. Invadează străzile, scandând jos comunismul. Apoi un alt teatru, gesturile fiind împrumutate dintr-o piesă mai veche. De fapt, revoluția a început în Timișoara, pe 16 decembrie. Un mic protest în fața casei unui preot maghiar concediat fiindcă critica regimul s-a răspândit prin tot orașul, devenind un război deschis. Mii de oameni au ocupat piața Operei. Armata a răspuns cu gloanțe. Mulți ani după eveniment, când detaliile obscure au ieșit la suprafață, istoria a fost rescrisă, separând revolta de la Timișoara de lovitura de stat de la București. Ion Iliescu și cercul său plănuiau o lovitură împotriva lui Ceaușescu de câțiva ani. În ajunul revoltei, au profitat de golul de putere pentru a prelua controlul. După 6 luni, încă o lovitură, de data aceasta împotriva populației. În primăvara anului 90, mulțimea a ocupat piața Universității din București. Au organizat o adunare populară, au vorbit liber la microfon, au cerut demisia guvernului. Iliescu a zdrobit insurecția. După 54 de zile, rezistența a fost alungată de pe străzi. Străzile sunt goale și astăzi.
Okay, so now what I'm going to do, this was just to provide a bit of context. I'm going to leave this running in the background and hopefully it's not going to be too distracting from what I'm going to say. So in transit, what you're seeing here is one of the 3 works of the Commonplaces of Transition project that Joanne Richardson did between 2007 and 2008. The work the works in this project retrospectively reflect on the changes of 2 decades prior to their making, and are an active struggle to not let the post-communist condition, or what is known as such, be fixed in recent history. They wish to complicate and, I would argue, decolonize this history, especially from anti-communist views. The project wants to critically assess the notion of post-communism and to contest an image and political view of transition as a forward movement and as a way of instrumentalizing space and time for political purposes. Richardson's position to the post-communist condition was a response to the media landscape of the time, which was owned and run by media tycoons, some with intense political powers, and to the dominant political narratives, neoliberal and anti-communist. The work with the Media Collective, of which these are part of, and a collective she set up, were founded on the belief that in independent audiovisual production, in activist action, and in sharing information via open source and copyleft platforms. Richardson believed that the concepts of transition and that of post-communism needed to be critically assessed from the perspective of the lived local Romanian context. Commonplaces thus was invested in opening up, and I quote from Joanne, a critical dialogue about the meaning of transition and other alternatives to simply catching up with the global market, and was dedicated to, quote again, representing post-communism from the inside. The use of the term commonplaces in the title implied its double meaning as common places in the sense of geography or territory, and as commonplaces deriving from an understanding of transition as an ideology. It was made up of 3 works in transit, this one, 2 or 3 things about activism, quite clearly quoting the Godard film, and precarious lives. Precarious spaces and subject in the context of transition is the transition to neoliberalism, so just to make clear, is what I'm focusing on here today. And they are the categories which I think can help review critically recent history via moving image artwork in this case, or activist work more generally. So I will focus on these 2 works, In Transit and Precarious Lives. In Transit was made in 2008, and it questions transition as ideology and investigates the intertwining nationalist and consumerist coordinates of the post-communist period in Romania, as they were visible in the period. It uses using a mix of archive footage, still images from her personal collection, and new footage. Richardson aims to challenge the idea that transition is a forward movement, something which neoconservative anti-communist narratives have supported. She works with her personal memories and family archive with facts about the current economic, or the then economic situation of several major cities in Romania, with historical material, as you have seen, but also with interviews with contemporary philosophers and with narration using her own voice. One thread which the work follows is the role of the Daco-Roman heritage, and by this I mean this Romanian myth of origin founded on the Dacian people who faced the sieges of the Roman Empire, but who were considered the founding fathers of the nation, a people often portrayed in nationalist recuperation as mystic but very technologically advanced. This myth was at the root of Ceausescu's convictions about this Daco-Roman continuity, as much as it has been a point of return in both right-wing nationalist discourses before 1945, so before communism, and as much as it is a trope reoccurring in contemporary conservative nationalist narratives. So she calls up the role of this Daco-Roman heritage in supporting both the communist ideology, which was a specific communist reading to the Romanian, or a reading of communism very specific to the Romanian context, and this national right-wing views re-emerging in what was called post-communism, and then the process through which this heritage finally blended with neoliberal consumerism. These superimpositions are progressively developed throughout the work with the use of montage. The layers are made visible, for example, in the images from Cluj, a city where the right-wing mayor Gheorghe Funar had used as a canvas to paint in the colors of the Romanian flag in order to emphasize this particular origin. And so he ordered archaeological sites to be opened and the ruins to be exposed through glass screens. You will see some images of urban furniture being painted in the colors of the flag at some point. Then the city was run by a liberal mayor, and investment in real estate started pouring in for a short while, when the largest shopping mall in the country was being built in the same city. And then the Daco-Roman ruins, other Daco-Roman ruins were found in its foundations. The decision, one would normally say surprisingly, was not to cease building the mall, but to incorporate an archaeological museum within its premises. With this incorporation and the paint in the city by then chipping away and showing the colors of the Romanian flag again in the urban furniture, the superimpositions were quite clearly visible. All nationalisms are built on myths of origin, but the Romanian one is even more mythical, says Richardson. This is not only in the visible in the post-communist right-wing or neoliberal moments from recent Romanian history, but it does manifest as a re-emerging trope. To show this continuity and this deeper connection, Richardson uses material from an interview with philosopher Gaspar Miklos Tamas, who argues that Romanian communism was not based on a Marxist-Leninist ideology, but on a theory of this Daco-Roman continuity. Tamas is adamant in referring to specific local aspects that prove that calling Romanian communism a form of Soviet totalitarianism is not correct. In fact, a heavy proto-nationalist baggage shaped Romanian communism considerably, and especially Ceausescu's interpretation of Marxism-Leninism. Moreover, Tamas also reminds us of Romania's fascist past, most notably visible in recent history around the Iron Guard and the military dictatorship of a figure named Ion Antonescu, under whose rule Romania had been prior to the stating of communism. Richardson traces the sudden appearance of these ruins in the mall to the connection with the nationalist communist past, and previously to its fascist past. These pasts seem to meet for a moment in 2007, when Romanian transition had been declared over. Flows of foreign capital entered the country, a museum lived inside a mall, and the national flag appeared from layers of paint in the urban furniture. Unsurprisingly, this thread was going to be enriched just 1 year later by one of the most recent crises of capitalism. On the backdrop of these crises, what resurfaced in a post-communist Romania were all of these traces of nationalism, post-fascism, and this is in Tamas's terms, and these insertions of capital. In Transit untangles Romania's history as much as it contributes to complicating reductive views, which imagine 1989 as a break from one state, communism, socialism, to another, neoliberalism, capitalism. Most commonly encountered as the well-known conservative phrasing of Francis Fukuyama, the end of socialism became the end of history, from which point there was only one other conceivable stage, capitalism. In this linear view, temporality and spatiality were subsumed to the progressive accumulation of forward movement. In Romania, Vladimir Tismananu, one of the dominant neoconservative figures, wrote that, quote, looking back and thinking forward, end quote, needed to become the two types of movements and attitudes to have in post-communism. More exactly, back was the communist space, failed and left behind, whilst forward was a thinkable time and a space imaginable and aspirational of the future. He read the prefix post in post-communism as if it described the measurable time, which was going to begin at a given moment when transition was over. Whether stemming from orthodox political science, geopolitics, or at the intersection of sociological or cultural studies, aligned, however, to more conservative approaches, later incarnations, informed by these ideas, share the teleological character, where a scientifically foreseeable end point of transition into democracy and capital and neoliberalism could be determined. This brought such approaches in alignment with the technocratic valencies of neoliberalism, disregarding specific local, spatial, and temporal rhythms of development, and foreclosing diversity by offering a one-fits-all model of transition. But most importantly, as Boris Budin observed, these ideas supported that, quote, the question of the future in post-communism was considered as already answered. Progress in these anti-Marxist views was not brought about or brought forward by revolution. Rather, the events of 1989 were reconceptualized as rebirths, new beginnings, which allowed building on empty grounds. The passage from one state or stage into another was made towards an envisaged goal, as if, quote from Budin, the transition to democracy started as a radical reconstruction out of nothing. Thus, understanding the 1989 revolutions as rebirths also allowed seeing post-communist space as an empty, raised ground, a space where building anew was fully legitimated. Consequently, the space after 1989 became the landscape after a battle, an exit point from communism, a space ready for the next attack, or in the most positive versions, a space for fighting for a public sphere. In a more nuanced approach, Krishna Kumar believed that the space of Eastern Europe has historically been caught in between empires on one and the other side of a fault line, acting as a buffer zone. However, this unbearable burden of history Eastern and Central European countries might have shared fell short of factoring in local specificity and implied that this space in the world had reached such uniformity as consequence of a certain political and economic dependency on stronger states or from a shared ideology. This uniformity, Kumar argues, was also observable, and I quote from him, in the case of Latin America, which leads him to suggest that the three-world ordering, made obsolete by the end of the Cold War, was replaced by a certain center margin or center periphery, spatial composition and worldview. The spatial reorganization might also be unable to fully account for the particular contexts and histories of the countries in question. The risk of using this geographical argument is that it can privilege spaces and disregard the people who inhabit them. Often the post-communist subject is imagined as caught or trapped in these time spaces, forgotten, disillusioned, and pessimistic, unprepared and unemancipated, waiting on a backdrop of a ruined scenery for foreign investors. Acknowledging Romania's violent past and the specific violent configurations of what came to be known as Romanian communism, Richardson wishes to complicate reductive views of both these pasts and to counter the concept of transition, especially in how it has been linked to ideology and used for political and economic gain of several right-wing and liberal governments in post-communism. Key moments in recent Romanian history should thus be addressed critically, anchored in a commitment to decolonize an imagination of space and time organized in blocks, which, when internalized, takes the place of remembering, and that was a quote from Richardson. Her work reflects on how, in retrospect, a post-communist Romanian subject can be understood, what this subjectivity is like, and what its specific characteristics are. Overall, it outlines that the Romanian post-communist subject belongs to an ethnic minority, which is often traced, leveled out, gendered, and precarious. As worker or artist, migrant or local, the subject is shaped by past and current violence against her from all of these coordinates. The subject is in post-communist time-space is thus critically reviewed by Richardson to stand at odds with transitologists' ideas of the subject, which has to move, to develop, to keep up, and to reform. She rejects this image of the post-communist subjects who moves forward regardless of their condition. And I'm just going to make a very few notes on precarious lives because it ties in with this idea of subjectivity, I think, quite well. And in that work from 2008, that work was made with the hope of nuancing a pervasive idea, increasingly influential at the time, in which, quote from Richardson, the cultural worker has become the model precariat, the new subject of history. To nuance this model of the precariat in the Romanian context is to ask, for example, how a post-communist female subject is, or better, has always been precarious. And how can this precarity speak of the long history of gender inequality, which travels from the contemporary Romanian situation into the recent past? Richardson states in Precarious Lives that, quote, many university-educated experts now work in conditions common to women across time, at home, with unpredictable hours, with periods of inactivity, without contracts, without rights. The idea of a common precarity ignores the inequalities that place some workers in conditions of disadvantage. Well, this has gone worse on both ends by now, as we know, but yeah. What then does it mean to be a precarious subject in the given context of Romanian post-communism? In Precarious Lives, she performs interviews with women, and these interviews remind us of the gender inequalities pervasive in the recent communist past, like criminalized abortion and the unequal division of domestic labor, as much as they reflect the condition of women in post-communism. This position invites us to revisit conversations and theories about precarities from this local and specific and heterogeneous perspective of the lived experience of communism and that of this thing called post-communism. Thus, the Romanian post-communist subject, Richardson suggests, has been shaped by these specific conditions of her time and those of the recent histories. Her memories of these inequalities was not erased by passing into post-communism. She was not catching up, nor has the lived experience of communism been for women a future they were traveling kind of back from into post-communism. Instead, the female subject in post-communism lived her history of inequality and precariousness in the time leading up to this radical break, imagined as the end of history, and then into the recent history, riddled with unequal migrant labor and equally with more precarity. Her precarious condition has remained a constant in this flow of temporality. And I could stop here, or I could go on for another couple of paragraphs. I have 2 more paragraphs, literally. Yeah, is that okay? Ovidiu Țichindelanu centers this concern of Richardson's work in a question. How could one talk about feminism and gender-related issues, avoiding copying a Western paradigm, and at the same time talk about local problems without imprinting exoticism onto oneself? The subject of post-communist Romania remained relatively unsure when the transition started, but she was informed it had ended around 2007 with Romania's integration into the structures of the European Union. From that point, the Romanian post-communist subject has had a recognized experience in this space as of, to quote Etienne Balibar, the unresolved political problem, which is Europe. And she's had this experience in migrant moving or fixed coordinates. Privileged somewhat by comparison with migrants from the global south who died at Europe's shore, the Romanian post-communist subject was no longer in transition, she was told, when the integration into European structures occurred. She was free to move, to work, and to travel. At the same time, the arguable integration was precisely into this unresolved problem. a time-space with a dark history of slavery, into the violent flows of European modernity, and into more recent fascist pasts. Romania too has had these dark histories of violence, and Richardson discussed some of these traces in the work In Transit. Violence also partially legitimated political and economic structures throughout the period of transition. Racism, dispossession, gender inequality, precarity, sometimes nationalist recuperations of the Daco-Roman past are not divorced from, but continuous with, the communist period, and were equally present in post-communism as much as they are present in the contemporary. Joanne Richardson intended to make these connections and continuities visible through this project, Commonplaces of Transition, as well as to question the specific inequalities and abuses produced in the period that we have come to call post-communist.
Thank you all for coming. I want to start by just talking a little bit in general terms about the aesthetics of television versus the aesthetics of cinema. Critical orthodoxies around television consider it a medium of limited visual appeal, incapable of the spectacle or rich mise-en-scène of cinema. The developmental model assumes that television drama is largely theatrical in its form, with interior dialogue scenes aesthetically composed of facial close-ups or two-shots, what Jason Jacobs calls the intimate screen. Cinema is assumed to be visual, while television is oral, driven largely by dialogue. The key site of television drama is Raymond Williams' dramatic room, while its smaller screen is unable to depict cinematic spectacle, action, or landscape. Furthermore, the cinematic is theorized as a visual form demanding the concentrated gaze, and the dialogue-driven televisual as importuning the distracted glance, primarily through its soundtrack. Only recently in this model has television aesthetics advanced to approach the level of cinema. Robin Nelson argues that in about the last 20 years there's been the emergence of what he calls high-end television. This has led conventional approaches to duopoly-era British television up to 1982 to neglect its aesthetics in favour of political critique focused on representations of class or gender. So this paper looks at two adaptations of John le Carré's novel Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, the 1979 BBC TV adaptation and 2011 cinema version, to investigate the aesthetics of cinema and television and problematise some of the reductive essentialisms of the developmental model. Michael Bakhtin argues that place in fiction constitutes a chronotope or a dramatic time-space intrinsic to the narratives taking place within it. This paper uses space and place to construct a theoretical framework drawing on Bourdieu, which assumes that place is a structuring structure, dialectically reflecting and shaping the activities going on within it. In terms of the aesthetics of dramatic place, how space is framed for the camera, space is framing both in terms of shaping activity and in giving meaning to space. The paper examines some key narrative sites depicted in the serial and the film, and considers how they're represented on screen and how they construct the activities, both production and narrative, taking place within them. The plot of the novel concerns a spy or a mole in a senior position within the British Secret Service, and retired spy master George Smiley's attempts to find the spy. The spy is responsible for an ambush in Czechoslovakia, which almost kills British agent Jim Prideaux, and this event is tied to the disappearance of a Soviet agent in Hong Kong, Lisbon on TV, Budapest in the film. The television serial opens with a pre-title sequence showing a high-angle exterior shot of Cambridge Circus, a slightly seedy part of London near Soho, and le Carré's location for his fictional Secret Service headquarters. The serial's establishing shot of the narrative's geographical and ideological heart is followed by an interior scene showing the circus heads assembling in a committee room. The high-angle wide shot of the circus building is a narrativized composition, implying that the institution is under covert observation and establishing the theme of surveillance. The nominative connection of the circus with Cambridge University reflects the book's preoccupation with the class structures of the British establishment. Cambridge Circus also had then associations with Marxism and Russian politics, thanks to the presence of Collett's Radical Bookshop on nearby Charing Cross Road. Writer John le Carré also points out the nostalgic, introverted nature of the institution's internal politics. He had been a spy himself at one point, whereby personnel were defined by their Second World War exploits. Quote, "It stank of war nostalgia." The circus interiors were filmed in former Ministry of Defence premises in Westminster's Cork Street for the TV version. The cameraman, Tony Pearce-Roberts, says paper was put over the windows and then powerful lights were shone through, mounted on the scaffolding. In those days, film stocks were pretty slow. So what you do is you put tracing paper on the window, you put all your lights outside, and the camera was right at the furthest, as far back in the room you could possibly get, on the longest lens you could possibly get. And any movement just came from having to pan the camera with the actor. This is from an interview I did with him in 2010. The long lens on these interior scenes compresses distance and defocuses distracting backgrounds, a bit like what Rob was talking about in terms of Turkish film. And this approach seems to aim at generating a claustrophobic interiority, as well as limiting camera movement. Seen from inside, the blank windows of the circus offer no view of the outside world, suggesting the extent to which the circus, with its internal politics and arcane language of tradecraft, is enclosed and insular. For the director John Irvin, the interiority of the circus is key to the narrative, as he employs a spatial metaphor to describe his approach to the serial. Quote, "I saw my version of it as a labyrinth with a very dark secret in the centre of it." The diegetic setting, therefore, becomes a metaphor for narrative complexity. Irvin also implies parallels between the BBC, the circus, and Prideaux's boarding school in the serial. Quote, "I based my version on the corridors of the BBC. This circus was a combination in my imagination, really, of all the intrigues, jealousies, rivalries within the departments of the BBC, and combined with my schoolmasters, my boarding school." According to cameraman Tony Pearce-Roberts, some scenes were actually filmed on BBC premises. It's tempting, therefore, to relate the inward-looking panoptic circus interiors to the institutional corridors of the BBC. In an interview I did with him, producer Jonathan Powell confirmed the parallel. Quote, "It was also about the BBC, about what length does an institution have to do to survive in a changing political climate." That was what the metaphor was. The serial's establishing exterior shot of Cambridge Circus is followed by an interior sequence beginning on the closed door of a committee room, seen from the inside as the circus heads enter through the door left of frame and walk to the committee table. A new shot begins with the entrance of each character, and each character displays a range of performative signifiers. We haven't got time for the full clip because it's over 2 minutes. But in the top screen caps there, you can see Toby Esterhazy, who's turned up promptly. He checks an old-fashioned pocket watch. The next row, the character Roy Bland enters, reading his committee papers, obviously a bit unprepared, coughing and smoking a cigarette. In the next row, Percy Allaline pointedly glances at an empty chair and sits at the head of the table. And in the bottom row, Bill Hayden enters balancing a saucer on a cup, kicks the door not quite shut. Esterhazy rises and closes it. Although filmed on location, this scene utilises the centripetalism of studio drama, bringing these characters together in a dramatic room. There's something of theatrical staging convention in the way each character is introduced with shots on the door which allow them to enter individually, akin to a stage entrance, using the committee room as a 3-wall set. With a single line of dialogue, this scene visually establishes their personalities and characterizations. And these characters, it later transpires, are the 4 suspected of being the mole. This scene demonstrates what John Cockey has talked about in terms of British television as a drama of incident and character, in which detail plays a very particular part. We can also use Roland Barthes' idea of the readerly and writerly here, or easy and difficult. Viewers are given no formal explanation of characters' identities or their status in the narrative. The details of dress and performance evoking character in a scene with virtually no dialogue requires careful observation, more akin to the cinematic gaze than what John Ellis calls the televisual glance. There are tensions evident in this sequence then between the potential cinematic of film as a medium and the televisual, or even theatrical, of the dramatic room, between the readerly of television as a dialogue-driven, easy, accessible medium, and the writerly of the novel's convoluted plot conveyed here through enigmatic performance. Using the real Cambridge Circus in the television serial shows an aspiration to realise Le Carré's vision faithfully, utilising the sense of place offered by what Geoffrey Noel Smith calls the ontological link between nominal setting and actual location. There's an auratic power in the use of location representing itself, which would be impossible to reproduce through creating a replica in studio or utilising a physically similar but inauthentic location. However, Charlotte Brunsden argues that, quote, cinematic place has no necessary relationship to location shooting. The location shooting may offer particular qualities to the mise-en-scène. Thus, she says, Brick Lane filmed away from Brick Lane may be more interesting as a cinematic space than any location shot version. While the television serial's use of Cambridge Circus demonstrates this ontological link, the 2011 cinema film is less faithful to the novel. Directed by Thomas Alfredson, the cinema version of Tinker Tailor was released in autumn 2011. The cinematic circus exterior was filmed at Blythe House in London's West Kensington, currently part of another British state institution, the Victoria and Albert Museum, thus rendering the circus nickname meaningless. It therefore demonstrates the tension between Noel Smith's ontological link and Brunston's imagined diegesis, suggesting that the film's fidelity to the novel is less important than a sense of visual spectacle, giving the cinematic circus a constructed authenticity, meeting the expectations of international audiences. The grand Blythe House circus is introduced via a low-angle tilt as a red London bus passes in the foreground, the shot composition conveying the idea of concealment and revelation as the bus reveals the circus. The red bus is an archetypal metonym of what Charlotte Brunston has called London discourse, and establishes a clear geographical location for international audiences. The film later presents spectacular overhead shots of the modernist circus building, digitally added inside Blythe House. This shot provides a visual metaphor for the Secret Service. The Victorian exterior suggests normative visual discourses of British imperialism, while the concealed circus building is redolent of soulless repressive bureaucracy. Its drab functionalism is also reminiscent of brutalist architecture associated with Eastern Europe, implicitly paralleling the circus and its Russian counterpart. It's therefore an architectural metaphor for the Soviet mole at the heart of the circus, and the Victorian facade, enclosing concrete modernism, visually realises themes of concealment, betrayal, and loss of empire. The circus interiors for the film were shot in Ingalls Barracks in North London, presenting an open-plan, multi-level space containing office modules lined with orange soundproofing material. These modules signify secrecy and paranoia, as well as the insularity of the circus. Director Thomas Alfredson comments, quote, "The reality was like long closed corridors, but I thought it wasn't very cinematic to depict long closed corridors, so that's a complete fake, the open landscape thing with the cubes." The barracks location connotes militarism, and the space's openness offers visual counterpoint to the claustrophobic paranoia of the circus. Open spaces can be as disciplinary as confined ones. Kim Dovey says, quote, "The deterministic conflation of physical enclosure with social constraint, or of open space with liberty, is a dangerous move. An open spatial syntax can operate as a powerful signifier of solidarity and democracy in the absence of the practice." The television serial's Labyrinth of Corridors is contrasted by Alfredson's cinematic barracks, suggesting that it's dramatic space's scale which differentiates the two media. That said, the panoptic cinematic circus functions as a constraining dramatic room, containing further rooms in the form of the soundproof modules. This space, therefore, has a further metaphoric function. It's rooms within rooms paralleling the mise en abîme motif of Russian matryoshka dolls referenced in the novel, page 381, and used in the television serial's titles to signify the mole's hidden identity. The orange soundproof modules have a further metaphoric function, as David Bordwell points out. The film shows Control's suspected mole through photos taped to chessmen and marked with the codenames Tinker, Tailor, Poor Man, Beggarman, Soldier. Bordwell links the internal texture of the soundproof modules with the chess piece motif, connecting mise-en-scène with theme and narrative. Quote, "The chess pieces visualise the multiple choice problem. More broadly, the imagery with the briefing room as a gridded checkerboard reminds us that spying, known for decades as the great game, is now a global chess match." This metaphor will be developed later in this paper. Back to the television sequence. After the opening circus sequence, much of the television serial's first episode is taken up with a lengthy sequence very close to the novel, following Prideaux's mission in Czechoslovakia, as he tries to evade enemy agents across a grim landscape of waste ground, industrial arcades, rundown social housing, and dreary shopping centres. After Charlotte Brunston's assertion that cinematic spaces don't require an ontological link, the Czechoslovakia sequence in the BBC Tinker Tailor draws on a variety of place discourses to construct its narrative topography. The geopolitical climate in the 1970s meant that filming behind the Iron Curtain was problematic, and other geographical peripheries supplemented this discourse of place. According to cameraman Tony Pierce-Roberts, most of the Czech sequence was shot in Glasgow. Austin Spriggs, the designer, had been to the Czech Republic and taken lots of stills, for which he got arrested, and lots of posters and things like that. You know, the sort of things that tourists wouldn't be doing, because of course it was still a communist regime at that point. Prideaux's journey begins with a shot of his face through a car windscreen in close shot as a foreground security barrier rises out of frame. A long shot showing a red-roofed house in Mobile garage signifies generalised Central Europeanness, intercut with point-of-view shots of the empty road and close-ups of Prideaux's face. In part, these shots are determined by practical necessities. Tony Pierce-Roberts told me, in the classic way, the BBC had picked lots of actors who were supposed to drive and, of course, couldn't drive. So we had to shoot a lot of plates. So we went to the Czech Republic to shoot some plates, because funnily enough, they didn't mind me filming out the backs of cars and things like that. The space constructed by this sequence then is asyndetic, combining long shots of the car filmed in Czechoslovakia and checkpoint shots filmed in Glasgow. And actually, this is a particularly interesting shot. You can't maybe see it terribly well here, but this is the Glasgow street. But everything above the ground floor is a glass painting put in front of the camera in order to construct this vaguely Central European type of architecture. When we get to the big ambush sequence, the ambush is staged entirely at night, with troops, attack dogs, and an exploding car. The establishing wide shots of the rendezvous area use the height of the trees and careful backbiting to construct a mise-en-scène of cinematic scale. And the backlit chiaroscuro of the hazy blue light through the trees during the ambush aspires to the cinematic, emphasising the verticality of the trees and turning their trunks into the bars of a cage as the track closes on Prideaux. Devoid of English dialogue, with its few lines subtitled, this sequence is writerly, relying on audience knowledge of the novel or an attentive cinematic gaze. The ambush sequence shows an aspiration to the cinematic in both its scale and its writerly quality. The production's consumption of a Scottish location results in the production team's consumption by place, as the sociologist John Urry has argued can happen. Tony Pierce-Roberts recalls, it should have been shot in Black Park, quite frankly, because it was night, there were trees, and frankly it could have been anywhere, and I didn't know quite why they opted to do that, because it meant taking lots of generators all the way up to Glasgow, it meant taking a very large lantern called a Wendy's light into a huge forest, and of course the weather was appalling, and one of the generators got stuck on the way into the forest, so we were delayed for about 2 days while they pulled it out. Colin MacArthur in 1982 notes that while Glasgow has a complex cultural identity, such as the no mean city discourse of impoverished slums, or the left-wing red Clydeside, the city has no prevailing visual place myth. It doesn't have any particularly interesting architectural features, and thus has sufficient plasticity of place in the 1970s to substitute for a Soviet industrial town and a Czech forest. Substituting for Czechoslovakia as a perilous marginal site, left-wing proletarian 1970s Glasgow is peripheral to the London-based BBC drama department. But its use also signifies the production's distinction in being able to travel so far, signalling symbolic capital for this production. If studio television drama habitually utilises a form of diegetic metonymy, with characters describing and narrating events, this sequence demonstrates a more mimetic, implicitly cinematic approach to spectacle. Location filming allows fully realised action, as well as the aesthetic ambition of the chiaroscuro of the backlit trees. Furthermore, the sequence generically aligns the serial with the spy thriller and puts an expensive action sequence on screen in its opening episode. The mimetic action sequence and the repositioning of Prideaux's mission, giving the serial the causal drive of classical cinema narration, could be seen as readerly, but this quality is in tension with the writerliness of the slow pace and narrative obscurity of the largely dialogue-free Czechoslovakia sequences. While the cinematic might be thought to offer landscape action and spectacle, as opposed to television's intimate interior detail, the 2011 cinema adaptation presents Prideaux's mission with much more geographical compression and constraint. The sequence is relocated to Budapest, and Prideaux's journey is compressed into a montage of tourist-friendly establishing shots of the Hungarian Parliament building, supported by the character Control's voiceover, "I want you to go to Budapest." A wide shot of an arcade is held long enough for the viewer to take in Prideaux's position at a pavement cafe and place signifiers of Hungarian language signage and Gothic architecture. This symmetrical composition establishes the arcade as menacing, turning Budapest into a dramatic room, its walls framing Prideaux and foreshadowing the imminent ambush. The ambush is confined to a single site and relies on a build-up of tension through details such as sweat on a waiter's face, cups rattling from the vibration of underground trains, rather than the television serial's mimetic realisation of the novel's, quote, military tattoo. The cinema version presents this sequence much less cinematically in terms of action spectacle than does the television adaptation, demonstrating that essentialising models of television's innate intimacy and focus on detail are inadequate. Television, then, is clearly capable of expressive and spectacular use of landscape. However, despite the spectacle of episodes 1 and 2, the dramatic room is a persistent trope of the television tinker-tailor and leads to a proliferation of close-ups of what Troy Kennedy Martin calls faces talking and faces reacting. The 2011 film doesn't rely on compressing characters into shabby claustrophobic rooms in the same way, but instead turns its more expansive spaces into grids, constructing space as a series of layered frames to suggest observation and entrapment. Characters are isolated within intradiegetic frames, behind transparent layers, or both. The Islay Hotel window, the internal windows of the circus, the Budapest arcade windows, the Istanbul harbour building windows, reinforced mesh glass in the garage, the windows of Smiley's house, all make space liminal by dividing it up and placing frames and grids between camera and characters, transforming the screen into another version of Bordwell's checkerboard motif. Shots through the windows of cars and caravans emphasise the liminality of these unfixed structures, boxing the characters in and recalling the circus's soundproof modules. Symmetrical framings compress people into dramatic rooms, such as the Budapest arcade and the nursery interrogation cell. Exterior wide shots of architecture divide the screen into further boxes, such as the composite long shots of the circus archive or the Istanbul hotel exterior. Intradiegetic window frames turning the screen into a grid, which converts characters into pawns on a chessboard, isolated within discrete but observed dramatic rooms. These layers of transparency blur discrete spaces, connecting inside and outside and confusing clear definitions of place, while reflections in glass over the main action make these sites liminal and heterotopic, emphasising themes of surveillance, instability, identity, and threat. In the film's closing montage, Prideaux is seen boxed in through the window of his caravan. Tar is seen behind vertical railings reminiscent of prison bars. Connie is framed within a sash window. And Hayden is shot through wire mesh at the nursery, the characters confined by on-screen lines and layers which separate them from the camera and alienate them from the world. Even Smiley, the new circus head, is caged within the hard verticals of railings and windows. The film traps its protagonists by using transparent layers and intradiegetic frames to divide the screen. Even expansive cinematic space becomes a cage. So comparison of the 1979 television serial with the 2011 film has demonstrated that the cinema adaptation exploits the conventions of the dramatic room, while the television serial's fidelity to its source novel results in a wider canvas and more mimetic action than equivalent sequences in the cinema version. However, the checkerboard motif pervading the 2011 version's mise-en-scène arguably makes it more obviously cinematic than the television serial in its developed integration of a cage motif as a visual metaphor connecting narrative and aesthetic through the production. Essentializing assumptions of the televisual as a closed text and cinema as an open text are consequently shown to be overdetermined. Thank you.